It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of 12-year-olds. It was the age of foolishness. I had just turned 12 in the summer of 19... And my parents said that I could invite over to help celebrate some of my friends and classmates. So I invited 4 or 5 of my friends and classmates over. And we were going to have a wonderful time. We were going to have a sleepover, or whatever the manly equivalent of that term is. And to understand, you have to know a little bit about where we lived. We lived in Grand Junction, and Grand Junction is a very hot place in the summer, quite often. And my house, our house, was right underneath the cliffs of the Colorado National Monument. Our back fence was the buffalo fence that kept the buffaloes in the Colorado National Monument and away from us. And my parents had a little over 300 acres, and this wasn't just flat acres. This was like Moab acres. We had our own sandstone cliffs. We had a ravine that went through with a stream. We had a spring down there. My father had actually built a little dam that helped to keep it into a little pool. Every so often we would have a flash flood that would come over the cliffs of the monument and wipe out everything that my dad had built in that little ravine. But it was a wonderful place. It was like a 300-acre park for my friends and me to play on to help celebrate my birthday. Now, turning loose 5 or 6 12-year-old boys in that kind of a place, what could possibly go wrong? Well, we started out fine. We wandered through. We went to a place where quite often I could find arrowheads. We looked around and spent a little time there. But eventually we ended up down in the ravine by the spring, and I don't know who did it. It was probably my friend Jeep. That was his nickname, Jeep. Probably was the first one to throw a large flat piece of sandstone right behind me and splash water all up over my back. Well, soon we were in a full-bore water fight. We were throwing rocks and splashing. We were throwing water on. We finally ended up in the water, and we were soaking. But like I said, it was hot. We were having a wonderful time. The Apostle John likes to talk about some wonderful times when Christ was here. And he will talk about how Christ spent his time healing people and what a wonderful time it was and how everybody was happy and how the healed people and their families were rejoicing. And then he has a habit of saying, "Oh, but I forgot to tell you, this was on the Sabbath day." And the legal experts and the Pharisees of the time were not happy with the joy and the wonder that Christ had brought to this family. They were very upset. They were angry that this young rabbi was breaking the rules of the Sabbath that they had established. Well, on my 12th birthday party, it was also the Sabbath day. And unknown to us, as we were wallowing in the water in that beautiful ravine, some of the local legal experts and parents were also out hiking around our property. And my father and mother and some of their friends came down to us, and they were not happy. They were quite upset that we were not keeping the Sabbath the way the Sabbath was supposed to be kept. Not only that, to my great embarrassment and disappointment, we went back to the house. They called the parents of each of my friends and asked them to come and pick up their boys and take them home because we had broken the Sabbath. I was terribly disappointed. I was terribly upset. I was terribly embarrassed, and I felt terribly guilty. It was the worst of times, one of the worst memories of my childhood. The next day, however, or soon thereafter, my father pulled me aside and he said, "Mark, I need to apologize to you." Those were words I very seldom heard from my parents. Usually I was the one who needed to apologize. But my father said, "I need to apologize to you. You are now old enough to know the meaning of the Sabbath and to choose for yourself how you want to keep the Sabbath. I shouldn't have wrecked your party. I shouldn't have called the parents. I am sorry." It's the first time I ever remember being treated as an adult by my parents. And I still remember it vividly. It was one of the best of times. Now, soon thereafter, they forgot about that and kept treating me like a kid, but I remember my father saying to me, "You are old enough to understand the meaning of the Sabbath, and you should decide for yourself how you keep the Sabbath." I have probably heard over 1,000 sermons on the Sabbath during my period of time as a Seventh-day Adventist. And almost every one of those sermons focuses on the validity of the Sabbath. Which day is the right day to keep the Sabbath? Not the meaning of the Sabbath. And we as Seventh-day Adventists have been known as people of the Bible because we have so well memorized the proof texts as to which day is the day we are supposed to keep the Sabbath that we are known as legalists to many of our Christian friends and colleagues because of our focus on what they think is a very legalistic point. The early Seventh-day Adventists were known for being great biblical scholars and debaters and arguers. In fact, early Adventist evangelists would go into a town and they would challenge the other Christians and the other pastors in that town to a debate on which day is the Sabbath. And almost always they were able to prove from the Bible and argue and debate to a conclusion that the seventh day was the Sabbath and that people should be keeping Saturday as the Sabbath. It reminds me of a statement from Dave Barry, the humorist who lives down in Miami, when he said, "I can win an argument on any topic against any opponent. People know this and steer clear of me at parties. Often, as a sign of their great respect, they don't even invite me." We as Seventh-day Adventists quit getting invited to many of the parties. We argued too well, and we were very obnoxious. But my father had said to me, not, "You should know which day is the Sabbath." My father had said to me, "You should know the meaning of the Sabbath. You're old enough to understand the meaning of the Sabbath." What is the meaning of the Sabbath? All of us are here today on Saturday, so I assume at least to some degree we agree that the validity of Saturday as the Sabbath is correct. But what is the meaning of the Sabbath? To understand that, I truly believe we have to go back to the beginning of time, at least the time on this world, and talk about the great controversy. Now, last time I preached about the great controversy, someone came up to my wife afterwards and said, "I'm new to this whole Adventist thing. What is the great controversy? I don't even understand what he's talking about." So let me clarify quickly for any of you who may not understand. We as Seventh-day Adventists have a belief that we call the great controversy between Christ and Satan. And we believe that after God created, one of his intelligent creatures rebelled against him and rebelled against his methods of running the universe, the way he governed the universe, and rebelled against his motives for creating, saying that God created beings really to be almost slaves to him, to do his will, whereas God said, no, I wanted to have relationships. I wanted to have a social interaction with my creatures. But this enemy of God, who later becomes known as Satan or the devil, started this war before this world was created. It's interesting to me that we as Seventh-day Adventists tend to be the denomination that focuses the most on both the Sabbath and the great controversy. Many other religions, many other Christian churches believe that there is a battle between good and evil. But we, as far as I have been able to find, are the only church, the only denomination that says that war was over the character of God. It wasn't over the power of God. It wasn't over who was in control. It was over God himself and his character, his motives, and his methods of running the universe. And so as we look at the Sabbath and we look at how God now is trying to respond to the civil war that he has on his hands, it is at this time that we see the creation of this world. Paul says that we were actually created as a theater for the universe, that this world was created to answer many of the questions that had been raised by Satan during the civil war or during his rebellion against God. And so as we look at creation and we look at the 7 days of creation or the 6 days of creation leading up to the seventh day, we see God doing something wonderful. We see him creating a beautiful garden with everything that could delight the eyes and the senses. We see him creating man. We then see him creating woman to be with man. To answer one of the charges of Satan was that God would not share his creative ability. And so God created man and woman who can create in their own image, little beings that too often are very much like the parents. And at the end of that creation week, God rested. Now, this is not the kind of rest when you are tired. It's the kind of rest that an attorney does after he has presented his case or she has presented her case. I rest my case. I have given the evidence that is needed in this particular time, and now I rest my case. God had now given the evidence that the universe could use to try to answer the questions that had been raised in the great controversy, and he rested his case. And he said, I want to have a special day. I'm going to set it aside. I'm going to hallow it. I'm going to call it the Sabbath. And in this period of time, I want to spend special time with you, Adam and Eve, my creatures. It wasn't Adam and Eve's seventh day. It was their second day. So there's no way they were tired. It isn't that we need a rest every 7 days because we get tired. It was something special, a time to be with God. Now, why was that important? We're told we were created in the image of God. How would we ever know, number one, that we were created in the image of God? And how would we ever learn what the image of God meant? Unless we had a special time or a special opportunity to learn to know what God is like. Now, because of the great controversy, God could not dominate our time. He couldn't spend all the time with us, and he also had to allow Satan to have some ability to tell his side of the story. And so in the Garden of Eden, he created 2 trees. One is the tree of life, where every day Adam and Eve had to go to eat to continue their eternal life. And right next to that tree, he created another tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And that was where Satan could tempt Adam and Eve. So every day, Adam and Eve walked to those trees, had the opportunity to be tempted, and had the opportunity to eat and continue their life. Satan also could not dominate their time and could not track them around the garden all the time trying to tempt them. It appears that he was limited to that tree. But each evening, God also spent special time with man, and then on the Sabbath, the whole 24-hour period was spent with Adam and Eve, teaching them both about themselves and about him, so that they would truly understand how they were created in the image of God, that they weren't just created as cosmic gardeners to take care of the Garden of Eden, but that they truly had within them the power to think and to do, the creativity that God had given to them. And they never would have known about that without this special time that God set up to be with him so that he could teach them about the image of God. We as humans still have huge problems understanding who we are. Why were we created? What are we doing here? What is my purpose in life? And this was what the Sabbath was created for, was for God to have that time to teach us what the image of God in man means. Unfortunately, Adam and Eve, as they were walking by that tree, Eve particularly, one day listened to a talking snake who said, "God's lying to you. All of this stuff he's been telling you about how good he is, about the riches that he wants to give you, about how he wants to help you grow, he's lying to you. He is actually keeping you from the full potential that you have. You can be like gods. And you don't have to go through a long learning process. If you just eat this fruit, it's a shortcut to you being like God." Unfortunately, Eve fell for the miraculous talking snake and trusted it more than she trusted God. And Adam soon followed thereafter. And so we have this rebellious distrust that comes into the universe. And the cancer of the universe is the distrust of God. And so no longer could God spend, as he had in the past, this special time with them, teaching them about the image of God in them, for they had lost to a large degree that image of God. They were separated from God. Before this time, there was no command to keep the Sabbath. It was like having a party every week. You don't command a child to go to a party. It's a wonderful thing. They looked forward to it. It was a great opportunity to spend with God, to learn about him, and to learn about themselves. There was no need for a command before sin came into the universe. But after sin came into the universe, there were other problems that we had to deal with. We had to deal with the natural consequences of sin that lead to things like death and destruction. And so God stepped into time and said, "I want to continue this courtship that I have had with you, this time of planned intimacy in space and time where we can be together. I want to help recreate you. I want to have this relationship with you." Some of you have had an experience with courtships. Some of you will maybe in the future have an experience with courtship. But the time of courtship is something that most of us look back on with great pleasure. Some of us look back on it as the only pleasure we had in that relationship. But it is a special time, a time when you are getting to know each other, when you are spending time together. Now, one of my friends, father-in-law or father-in-law's father, had a mail order bride where he sent off and basically bought a bride from the Ukraine and brought her over, and she became his wife. That's a rather truncated courtship, and it doesn't allow you the time to really get to know each other, to learn the ins and outs of your relationship, to find what is good, what is bad about it. In my relationship with my wife, and I've shared a little bit about this with you, There were a lot of things that my wife brought to our relationship. I've told you about how when I was a student missionary, she used to send me a letter almost every day, and on that letter she had painted a beautiful picture or drawn a beautiful picture, something to help make me feel not quite so lonely over there. I didn't tell you, though, about something else that she did for me. She also, and some of you young ones won't know what this is a jeans shirt, and it is embroidered. And you may not be able to see the beauty of the embroidery. You can come up afterwards and see this. But on the back, there is a beautiful picture of Africa, both where I was born and where I spent time as a student missionary. And my wife put hours of love into this embroidered shirt. She gave me something that was really worthwhile. She also used to make me cheesecake. And almost once a week, she would make a cheesecake for me. And she made brownies for me until she learned I didn't really like chocolate. There were many things I got out of the relationship with my wife during our courtship. Not only that, she was a pretty hot gymnast. Now, to put that in better language, my grandmother said, she comes from sturdy stock. Now, in a courtship, the focus can totally be on what do I get out of this relationship. Not so much what do I give to this relationship, but what do I get out of this relationship? We people, we human beings, want to be loved for who we are, or if Becky's watching, for whom we are, instead of for what we can give, for the richness that we may be able to give. Some people in my class wanted to marry a doctor or a lawyer or somebody that they thought could provide them with riches, make a comfortable living for them. Quite often, we look at the things that we can get from a relationship. God also can give us wonderful things. It's really what the book of Job is all about. God had given Job many children. He had given them cattle on 1,000 hills, camels, riches, one of the wealthiest men. And the argument between God and Satan over Job is, does he love you because of who you are, or does he just worship you because of what you've given him? The Sabbath is a time for us to again get into that relationship with God and to learn to know what God not only can give us, but to learn to know who God is. And so after the fall, God had to command us to take time. He had to command us to spend time with him because he knew that was the only way. Not only would we get to know who he is, but it was the only way we would get to know who we are. And so he said, I'm going to set here in the middle of my law a command for you to keep the Sabbath day. It is not an arbitrary command just testing our obedience. There is truly a reason for this, a reason for us to spend time. Now, last week, Tom Eichmann talked about his life-threatening experience and how he will never forget that life-threatening experience he went through. He's a better man than I am, and let me tell you why. Many of you know that about 14 years ago, I also had a life-threatening experience. I had a brain tumor. I didn't know what it was. I just began to have these weird sensations in my head and eventually began to sort of trip on things. And after all the testing, they found a tumor in my head a brain tumor, and they said it looks different than anything we've ever seen. We don't know what it is. I had been training for a marathon. I wanted to finish a marathon before I turned 50. I then was wondering if I would even live to be 50. And we went through a very trying experience, more so for my family, my children, and my wife than it was for me. But eventually we found that it was a benign tumor, and I feel very blessed. But the area where they cut, behind my left ear here, is still numb. I still have weird sensation there when I touch it. And I'm very thankful for that numbness. The reason is, when I went through that life-threatening experience, I too thought, I will never forget this. I will never forget that God has saved me, has given me another opportunity to live. But you know, after a month or 2 or 3 or 4, when I learned it was benign and everything was going to be okay, I started forgetting. I fell back into my old habits. I fell back into my old rituals. I didn't always remember how God had saved my life. That's how most of us humans are. We have a very poor memory of how God has helped us, about how God has blessed us. God knows that. And He says, you are going to need a Sabbath. I'm giving it to you not as a test. I'm giving it to you as a gift to remind you every week of who you are, of who I am, and of how we want to have this relationship, how I want to have this relationship with you. Remember the Sabbath day. I'm going to have to command you because otherwise you won't remember. And I'm going to put it in a list of rules because you keep forgetting. And this list of rules we call the 10 Commandments. Ellen White says in Christ's Object Lessons on page 315, the law is presented to all that there may be no mistake in regard to the kind of people whom God will have in His kingdom. When those who claim to be God's children become Christ-like in character, they will keep the law. Then the Lord can trust them to be the number who will compose the family of heaven. The 10 Commandments were given to us to describe for us the character of God and the characters He wants us to have. Now, Paul and James both, oftentimes we say they disagree with each other. Both of them say the fulfilling of the law is love. Love to God, love to our neighbors. Again, they are not arbitrary, severe, exacting rules. These are the things we need to have in our lives to be the people we were created to be. To have the image of God in our lives, we have to be loving, to be Christ-like. And every word in the 10 Commandments is important and helps to point out, to explain God's methods and His motives in the creation. In fact, every word is so important that Robert Barker was fined the equivalent of $500,000 and had his printer's license taken away from him back in 1631 because he left a word out of the Bible. It was a beautiful edition put out in 1631. In fact, Robert Barker was the printer who had printed the first edition for the King James, of the King James Version back in 1611. But he put out a new version in 1631. But unfortunately, he left one small little word out of the 7th commandment. He left the not out of thou shalt not commit adultery. So this beautiful Bible that went out across the land said, "Thou shalt commit adultery." When the archbishop found out about this, he was furious. He took it to King James. King James was furious. They took him before the Star Chamber. They charged him $50,000. They took away his printing license. And if you can find one of those Bibles now, they are worth hundreds of thousands of dollars because they gathered up as many as they could find and destroyed them. There are still a few left, and they are usually in museums. Most of them are in museums. But each word has an import. Everything God has told us is important. Not again because he wants to test us, but because it is a gift to us. It is the gift of love. The Sabbath is not an arbitrary test. It is a gift. My father was kind enough to me when I was 12 to say, "You should understand the meaning of the Sabbath." I did not understand the meaning of the Sabbath when I was 12. I'm not sure I understand the full meaning of the Sabbath now when I'm 6. I am continuing to learn about the meaning of the Sabbath. But let me summarize what we have learned about the Sabbath, what we have seen in what God is trying to do here. We were created in the image of God. A Sabbath is a time that was set aside during which we can learn to know what it means to be made in the image of God. Through rebellion, through sin, we lost much of the image of God, and we lost that direct relationship that we had with God on the Sabbath day. The law is a description of God's character. It tells us what the image of God is like. God is love. The law demands or describes how we love. And when we love, we fulfill the law. In our fallen state, though, and in our own strength, we can't keep the law. We cannot be perfect. We cannot love. And as I look around the audience, it's clear to see why I can't love all of you. Some of you are obnoxious. But God says when you combine humanity with divinity, you can keep the law. In fact, I'll show you how it's done. So God combined humanity with divinity in the life of Christ and showed us what a human being is like when they are perfectly reflecting the image of God. When we focus our lives on Christ, we are promised that we will be changed into his likeness. The Sabbath, when correctly observed, helps us to focus our lives on Christ. If we do that, the rest of that cascade will follow, and we will be changed into the likeness of God. The Sabbath is good news. The Sabbath is a wonderful gift that God has given to us. But it is not the gospel. The gospel, the ultimate good news, is eternal and universal. So the gospel can only be about God.